Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you're listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, our guest is Jan Eliot, a cartoonist from Oregon. She started cartooning when she was a divorced working mom trying to raise 2 daughters, work full-time, pay too many bills with too little money, and still have a little fun. Drawing, literally, from her own experiences, Jan tried to reflect real life and real emotions with empathy for anyone with too little time, money, or patience. Her first comic strip, Patience and Sarah, began as a weekly feature in a local alternative newspaper and ran for 3 years. It was reprinted in parenting magazines and books in the years following, giving Eliot the courage to try a second strip she called Sister City, which ran weekly in her local daily paper, the Eugene Register-Guard. It ran for 5 years when the strip was picked up by Universal Press Syndicate and renamed Stone Soup. On November 20th, 1995, after many years of wishing and hoping, Eliot saw her creation launched nationally as a daily comic strip. Today, we catch her as she winds into retirement, moving to Sunday-only strips after 20 years of producing her daily syndicated Stone Soup comic strip. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you so much. What a great introduction.
Well, it's really going to be quite lively and interesting to talk with you about the way you created your career. I know from an article I read in the Register-Guard about your retirement that when you started cartooning, you were just doing it with the support of a friend. Is that so?
It's true. I had a friend. I was looking for a creative outlet, and I didn't have any money, and I had a friend who thought I was funny and thought I should try cartooning. And cartooning is a very cheap enterprise. It really doesn't take much more than typing paper and a couple of Copic pens or Pilot pens, at least to get started. And I discovered that it was really fun to write about my life. So I just sort of headed down the path to see what would happen and was lucky enough to eventually have it turn into something that supported me.
Well, let's back up a little bit. Your friend said, try cartooning, you're funny. And I know from other reading that I've done that you were an art major in college. But had you studied cartooning?
I had not studied cartooning. I had studied drawing and also ceramics, so I had been a potter for a few years. But I studied drawing quite a bit in junior high, high school, and my first year of college. I even had an art teacher in high school that my mother hired for me. I love to draw. I had drawn my whole life, and I didn't know anything about cartooning, especially about the materials and how you produced something that would be readable in print. I actually bought some old books at a used bookstore from the 70s, things called The Secrets of Professional Cartooning and Backstage at the Strips, which was a book by Mort Walker, who created Beetle Bailey. But these books had the nuts and bolts of how to be a cartoonist, just in terms of the pens, what the ink, how you crosshatch, what kind of paper you work on, just very basic. How to use zip tone, which nobody even uses anymore because of Photoshop, but the basics of how you get started, and it was extremely helpful to me, and that was kind of how I learned.
So you brought your strips to your friend, who you have in quotes on your website, acted as your editor, in quotes.
Yeah, we had a deal. I was supposed to turn something in every Friday. That was the deal, because we usually saw each other Friday nights, and I was supposed to hand her something, which I mostly was able to do. It was like my first deadline ever.
And I know that from your website, she was a writer and succeeded in her writing as well. So you really did support each other. And I'm wondering what those early meetings were like. What did she say to you in being your editor to your strips?
Well, first of all, there's 2 different people here. The first person was a storyteller, not the person who was the writer who I met with for 25 years now having lunch. The first person was a storyteller, and she basically just put out her hand and said, "Where's what you were supposed to do this week?" She was a very stern person, and because of her, I felt obligated to turn out the strip. Later, when I was trying to create Sister City, I met with my friend Val every week for lunch, and it was the same idea, what have you done this week? But she was trying to write a novel, so I had the same question for her, what have you done this week? So it was a little more equal footing.
That sounds excellent. I mean, to tap the resources we have around us, to be interested in our work and to keep us going, and then to share our interest in their work. It's very important to anyone writing or anyone in the arts.
And I want to point out that my lunches with Val over the years have never been a critique. And I think it's important to have someone who's not there to critique your work. We don't do the same thing. I don't trust her judgment, nor does she trust mine on her work. I mean, we're not there to do that for each other. It's mostly to make each other accountable for actually having worked at all, which I know among your listeners there are many people who've said they're going to write a book, and it's still in their head.
Absolutely.
Because it's hard to get yourself to do it, hard to have the discipline.
Right. So that's a very good trick, to meet for lunch and present what you've worked on and not expect any critique. As you were into this, did you study anything about the history of cartooning and making cartoon strips?
I was very interested in the history of women in cartooning. The New Yorker magazine started out with a lot of women cartoonists, and many more than even they have today. And eventually that faded during past World War II, which sort of when women dropped out of everything, unfortunately. I was very interested in the early women who were cartoonists, because there really have never been terribly many of us. And some of the heritage of where cartooning started, but I think mostly I was interested in the women and the feminist perspectives that have been put into cartooning over the years.
I know that your work has been exhibited at the Charles Schulz Museum in Santa Rosa, the San Francisco Museum of Cartoon Art, also appeared in an exhibition in Lisbon, Portugal, and is acquired by the Library of Congress. They have 30 of your Stone Soup cartoons in their permanent collection. That gives it, cartooning and you, quite a bit of status and prestige. And from the inside, what do you think of cartooning as art?
I will back up and remind you that I started out as a potter. I had done drawing and painting, but I ended up in ceramics. And I had years of people telling me that wasn't art, that was craft. And then I became a cartoonist, and there are people who would love to say that that's not art, that's something else, illustration. I just am tired of the definition of what is or isn't art. I think if you let certain people define what is art, you would only have it be the work of male painters in Manhattan. So I think that what I do is art. I think cartooning is a wonderful art form. It affects people emotionally. It entertains. There's some beautiful, beautiful cartoons if you look back over the years at some of the great cartoonists. So I think it's art. I'm happy to call myself a cartoonist, but I also think I'm an artist.
I'm glad to hear that. Can you give us some of the names of some of the women cartoonists that you admire?
Helen Hawkinson was a New Yorker cartoonist. Mary Petty, also a wonderful New Yorker cartoonist who was kind of ghoulish in the style of the Addams Family. Liza Donnelly is a current New Yorker cartoonist, and she did a wonderful book on the history of women at the New Yorker. I also loved Dale Messick, who did Brenda Starr, and Dale Messick was not really named Dale, and she was part of a whole group of women who adopted androgynous names in order to get syndicated or published, where there was Marty Lank as well. Dale was really Dahlia, and she couldn't get anyone to buy Brenda Starr until she changed her name to Dale and submitted by mail instead of in person. And so I love those stories of women who had to get around things.
And succeeded.
Or use initials.
Yeah. So how would we find, if we wanted to find some of the cartoons by these people and read about their lives, is this work available?
Well, Helen Hawkinson, who is a wonderful New Yorker cartoonist and was in the New Yorker for 15 years, there are many books of hers in print, and you can find them pretty much guaranteed at used bookstores. There's a lot of her work out there. It's easy to find. Mary Petty, you might have to look online to see if you can find something. History of the New Yorker, of course, would have her work in it. But you could also just Google women in cartooning, and you'd be surprised at what you would come up with. And, of course, Dale Messick, I think there are Brenda Starr collections in print. And Liza Donnelly, I can't really recommend enough her book called Funny Ladies, which is a history of women at the New Yorker. It's so well written and so interesting, and you will see all these cartoonists you had no idea existed with really great bio information. Trina Robbins has done a lot of books on women in cartooning. If you Google Trina Robbins, that's been her passion, is keeping women in cartooning alive. I mean, it goes back to Rose O'Neill, who did the Cupies. It became the Campbell Soup Kids. So Trina Robbins, it's Robbins, also has some great collections.
Thank you. And you have 2 collections out of your own work.
I have 10 collections.
You have 10
I have
collections.
10 collections. I do.
How do you go about choosing what goes in a collection, and are they all available?
My collections are pretty much all the work as it's appeared in chronological order. I have not made collections based on a theme or anything. It's just as the works appeared. So you can read from book 1 to book 10 and read the whole story of Stone Soup, although book 10 only goes to a few years ago. There's still more work to go into books. You can find them all online or at fourpanelpress.com, which is my publisher's website. The only books you will not be able to come up with are book 1 and book 6. Those are both out of print at this point. They sometimes turn up used on used sites.
That's interesting, that 1 and 6.
Yeah.
And so I would like to tell people about your own website, which is stonesoupcartoons.com, correct?
Yes, and there's a book link there too.
Good, thank you.
And my blog, and you can contact me if you want.
Well, now that we know how to get in touch with you and how to find your work, tell us a little bit about your themes and your characters. And I think that cartooning is an art, and part of that art is writing. How you put your strips together, how you found your topics, how you created your characters.
I started writing, which it is really a lot about the writing, you're correct. I started writing about my family, and I was a divorced working mom with 2 little girls who fought a lot, the kid fighting, and then being a mom who didn't have enough money or enough time or enough patience to make it all work. And I just wrote about what was going on in my life and my frustrations. I started writing cartoons in the late 70s, early 80s, so feminism was a big topic as well. And the characters, I started with just a mom and 1 daughter to begin with, and by the time I did my second strip, it became 2 moms and 2 daughters plus some other little ones. It really was just out of my life initially, but the characters became very real and started demanding their own personalities, and they evolved and morphed and really became unique individuals that really aren't representative of anyone in my life, even though I do indeed have 2 daughters. But Holly and Alex are really their own people. Alex is a lot of me. When I was a little girl, I was very much the tomboy with a collection of bugs and slimy things. And Holly is just my sort of amalgamation of a irritating middle school girl, and I will say that with the caveat that I love middle school girls and middle school kids. It's a big time in a kid's life with tons of potential, and even though they're emotionally a mess sometimes, they're quite wonderful. So I have a lot of fun writing for her. But it really just came out of my life and the lives of people around me and what I was hearing in the news, what was going on with families around the world, and grew from there.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 Port Townsend. In case you've just joined us, you are listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Sheila is talking with Eugene, Oregon cartoonist Jan Eliot about her strip Stone Soup and Women in Cartooning.
So what do you think the function is of cartoon strips? Because when you say things that were going on in the news, things going on in our families, it does something for us culturally, I think, what a cartoonist does and brings to light. How would you say it?
I think it has 2 functions. One, simply to entertain. It's something lighthearted in the newspaper or online, if that's where you read your comics, something lighthearted and fun to give you perspective on your day. I think the second function, though, especially for someone like me, is I write very empathetically for parents and families and kids. I want and hope that people see themselves in my strip, and when their lives are hard for various reasons, they may see something in my strip that is affirming for what they're going through and make them feel better about what they've been struggling with. I just got the most amazing email from a woman in Minnesota who asked to buy the original of a strip I recently did where Val and Phil are talking about whether or not he reads current events, reads the newspaper, and have you read this article? And he immediately says no, and she says, why not? And he said, I can only control what I can control. I can control toast. Would you like some toast? And this woman wrote me with the most amazing letter about her. She's 73, has 2 children, both of whom are holding grudges against her from when they were teenagers, and she's 73 and still dealing with it. And she read my cartoon and realized, because she's been all these years trying to make it up to them or fix it with them or buy things for them that will make them be happier, and she read my cartoon and she realized, oh, I'm done. I can't control them. I can't control the situation. I can't control the past. I can make toast. And she was genuinely heartened and moved by the cartoon. And wow, I've really done my job if I can print something that makes someone reflect on their own life and gives them hope and comfort. That is the ultimate.
Absolutely, and it's exciting to hear that story, because for every one person who wrote to you, there are many more people who resonated with that cartoon and with many of yours. So you really have answered the question. I mean, cartoons get to people at a deep level in an amusing way.
Yes.
So,
and it's comfort. It's comfort food. It's,
I like that.
Oh my gosh. I see these girls misbehaving in this strip, and this is how it was dealt with, and my kids do the same thing, and I guess I can laugh at it.
Yes, comfort. I like that idea that it's comfort food. So did you have contemporary influences as you were developing your strips?
Yes, definitely. My first big influence, besides the women of the past, I would say my first contemporary was Nicole Hollander, who created the comic strip Sylvia. I very much loved Sylvia. I loved her snarkiness and her feminist humor. And I had a correspondence with her in the 80s, and she actually invited me to appear at a conference in New York and have my work shown. It was the first place I went after getting into the Observer to show my work. So she was a wonderful help to me. And then Lynn Johnston, who does For Better or For Worse, has been a friend for a long time and has been encouraging of my work from the very beginning. I first had a phone conversation with her a year before I got syndicated, and she pretty much predicted that I would get syndicated in a year, and she's just been a great friend, giving me a lot of great advice. I am a huge fan of Bill Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes, and I learned a lot about drawing cartoons from Calvin and Hobbes. I mean, he's just such an amazing writer and an amazing artist. He's the master, as far as I'm concerned. Oh, and then Claire Bretécher, who is, if your listeners have not heard of her, it's worth a Google. She is a French cartoonist, and she's kind of their Doonesbury. She writes social commentary about life in France, and her books have been translated. National Lampoon translated work of hers, and Kitchen Sink Press translated something of hers, so you can find English versions online. But she is very funny and very witty, and she does a great teenage girl, Agrippina, which there's a whole book devoted to. And if I run out of snark for Holly, I just read Agrippina and I get right back into teenage
and can you
snark.
Can you repeat her name, the cartoonist?
Her name is Claire with an E, Bretécher, Bretecher.
Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful cartoonist.
Thank you. So if someone was going to start cartooning, what would they have to be thinking about in terms of the characters they're developing and also creating them as cartoon characters? I mean, as writers, we often say, oh, that's just a cartoon character. That's not a real full-bodied character. And yet, in the hands of a good cartoonist, they aren't just a cartoon character.
That's kind of insulting to us.
Right. And for good reason, because your characters are way more than just, in quotes, a cartoon character. So tell us a little bit about what are the basics?
Well, the basics are twofold. One, if you write a strip like I do or Lynn Johnston did, which involves repeating characters, those characters develop hugely over time and become very full, and you will develop a readership, a following, based on the fact that your readers will fall in love with your characters and know who your characters are and anticipate how your characters are going to respond to certain things because you've written a full complex character that they are now very familiar with. That's one way of cartooning, and I love that kind of cartooning because I love telling stories, and I like not having to be hilariously funny every day like a gag cartoonist. I can tell a story, and readers love to follow it, and they are content with a smile and a giggle and something heartwarming. Gag cartoonists, that is the other kind of cartoon where you don't have repeating characters, but you have a really good joke every day. And you're a little bit more of a stand-up comic, but behind the veil. And those cartoonists don't develop characters that have any depth. So when someone says this is just a cartoon character, it's maybe a little bit more in that vein. But if you think you are a funny person and you just want to do jokes and you don't want to have to develop characters or tell stories, gag cartooning is for you. And gag cartooning lends itself quite well to some other markets like calendars and greeting cards. So they have kind of a one-up on us story cartoonists because it's hard to turn our stuff into other products.
I see.
Those are the two basic directions that you can go in terms of cartooning, unless, of course, you want to be in comic books or greeting cards or all these other areas where you can use it.
If you're just writing a piece of a story in your strip, and your character, though, is a well-developed character, what kind of relationship do you have to your character? Do you know your character before you start? Does your relationship develop? Like you said, some characters demanded their own stories. It must be an art to reduce this story to such a short space.
Yes, editing is everything. It is an art, and it's an art to write a 6-day story or a 12-day story that you can wrap up every day in a few sentences and have something a little bit funny every day, but then the story goes on. That's a real interesting art to be able to do that. Generally, I only do my stories for a week or two at a time because people, after a while, can't follow it. But the development of the character, once people really understand the character, there's less you have to say because people know what that character's thinking or how they would respond or what their history is. And the only way that you get that is by actually doing the cartoon over and over, just jumping in and doing it for years. It's hard to develop the characters just in your head and on a sketch pad. You have to start telling the stories and doing the gags and just writing a bunch of work. You have to produce a bunch of work, and they will develop on their own.
Do you draw before you write or write before you draw?
I almost always write before I draw. Once in a while, I'll have a funny image in my head, or I'll see something funny, and I draw the picture, and then I build a gag around it because it's just comical. I can't think of an example, but somebody stuck in a tree. I mean, there's things you might see that you could draw really great, and it would just be a cartoon almost in itself. But almost always, I sit down on Monday and just with a notebook, and I just write little bits of dialogue. I just write little tiny plays that are 4 panels or 3 panels long, and I just literally put pen to paper and start with a character saying something and see what comes.
So you start to think in panels, do you think?
I do. Well, I write, it's dialogue, so it's 2 people. So I'll write, Grandma says, I'm going to Thailand again, and Val says, can't believe you, or how wonderful, or whatever Val says. And there's a panel. And then the next panel is, Grandma says, well, da-da-da, and Val says, oh my gosh, and there's another panel. And there's a pacing to it. It's a little bit like writing an extended joke, and I just write it, and then I bracket it after I've written it. When I get to the gag, I bracket it and see how many panels I've got. I'm really used to doing it now, so I have a certain rhythm in my head. But sometimes I won't be able to tell it in less than 5 or 6 panels, and if it's for a daily strip, that's too much. So how can I edit it down, or do I need to turn it into a Sunday? Sometimes what I write for a daily isn't really enough for a Sunday, so it's a little bit of it's just an editing thing. It's an editing game you play, and the pacing is really important. It's, again, a little bit like stand-up comedy. The pacing of the text and the gag at the end, the bada boom, is important to make it work.
So you mentioned there's a difference between daily and Sunday. Sunday needs more in the strip than daily?
Well, you have theoretically more room. Newspapers have just really worked hard to minimize what we do over time, so it gets smaller and smaller, and I notice that some Sunday cartoonists are starting to just do 3 big panels or 1 big panel, because it used to be a Sunday comic filled a whole page or half a page. I mean, you really had a lot of room to develop a story, and that was the point of the Sunday, was that you could tell a longer story, do much more fun art. Readers could just kind of fall into the art and have fun looking for little details in the background. I still try to do 6 panels or more on a Sunday just so I can have a longer conversation. But the newspaper size has gotten so small that it will also mean that I'm still just drawing my characters generally from the waist up, because there isn't room to do full-body drawings unless you go to the full panel, the single-panel format. So you can get a better visual gag on Sunday because you do have room if you did just a big single panel. Zitz does this a lot, where there's a little introductory panel, and then there's a big picture where you can see the whole character, or you can see them falling or tripping on the stairs or catching footballs. Today, I think, is catching footballs. And so you can get more of the cartoon art in, which is what cartooning is supposed to be, funny pictures. Or you can get in more story, and unfortunately you kind of have to choose at this point because we don't have that much space anymore.
Oh, I haven't thought about how the shrinking size of a newspaper would affect the cartoons.
Well, not only the shrinking size of the paper, but how much room they give to the cartoon. I mean, in the early days of cartooning, newspapers were tabloids, and you got a whole page. That was when Gasoline Alley was new, Blondie, you got the whole page of a tabloid-sized paper. And then it went down to half a page. And even when I was a kid with the standard-sized newspaper, there were only 2 comics per page. They each got a half page. When Calvin and Hobbes came back from a sabbatical, he demanded a half page in order for newspapers to continue carrying him, and he got that, although it meant they had to drop other strips because they are running 6 cartoons per page. They're running 4 down the side and 1 long one like non sequitur straight up and down. They've just crammed so much more in and started shrinking how much space they give that it's just it's a real uphill battle.
Yes.
We don't complain because we're happy for our spots, but it is frustrating sometimes.
So now that you're retiring gradually,
semi-retiring,
right, and you know that there's new projects coming, I'm curious to know what you think about graphic novels.
I think graphic novels are extremely interesting. A lot of them are actually memoirs. We love to say that Alison Bechdel wrote the most amazing graphic novel, Fun Home. It's really a graphic memoir. A lot of graphic novels use the term graphic novel to try to separate themselves from comic book, and I think that's a little bit moot. It's all the same. There's good comic books and bad comic books, and good graphic novels and bad graphic novels, and calling it a graphic novel doesn't make it better. It's an interesting art form, and it's fun to watch it grow. It's not something that I have been particularly interested in because I'm more interested in writing. If I were going to do a new project with my characters, I would prefer to do something like a chapter book, a YA chapter book, where I'm doing more writing and I'm only doing a couple illustrations per chapter. That's more appealing to me. But there are some wonderful graphic novels out there and wonderful comic books and some wonderful things from overseas. A lot of what European cartoonists do are stunningly beautiful. Things that are sort of the new version of Tintin. I'm sure some of your listeners have read Tintin when they were young. And there's modern versions of that still coming out of Europe. So it's an interesting thing.
Well, I'm interested in your potential book in writing rather than just cartooning, or only cartooning, I should say, about middle school for young adult because of your interest, you said, in the age bracket of the middle school child who's got so much potential. I think that would be an exciting book to write and to read. Before we close, and we have to because our time is short, I'd like to repeat your website, which Jan Eliot's website is stonesoupcartoons.com, and you can find links to more writing by Jan and more cartoons, as well as links to her books, 10, you said, collections so far. And I want to thank you so much for informing us about cartooning and your life as a cartoonist, and I wish you lots of luck in your semi-retirement.
Thank you so much. Act 3 begins today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
You have been listening to In Conversation, Discussions on Writing and the Writing Life with Sheila Bender. For more of Sheila's interviews, please go to Sheila's website, www.writingitreal.com/audio.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman. Announcer is Kurt Vanderslice.